there's something within you that doesn't believe that you can be who you want to be, do what you want to do, and have what you want to have. And I want to also suggest that you tell yourself a different story, because there's only one you, there'll never be another. And the desires in you are messages, and they're problems to be fulfilled. So if you have a desire, a strong desire, that desire is meant to be fulfilled. That's why you're here on the planet, because you're the only one that can fulfill it. And you can do it by telling yourself a different story, one that's of benefit to you and not of, self-destructive ideas about who you are.
The Tom Screen podcast is owned and made possible by Ethical Marketing Service. If your business is struggling with Google or Facebook ads, maybe you're frustrated figuring it out, or there's a performance issue, Ethical Marketing Service has worked on hundreds of accounts and we can help in this area. If you would like to find out if we can help, it's a free, no salesy consultation call, and the link is in the description. Enjoy the episode.
Thomas Green here with Ethical Marketing Service. On the episode today, we have Darius Wallace. Darius, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I'm very glad to have you. Would you like to take a moment and tell the audience a bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. I'm an actor, speaker, and coach. I was born in Flint, Michigan, and people have probably heard of Flint because of the water crisis. Wasn't always like that. Have lived in New York, LA, spent many years living in Memphis, where I really, ironically enough, my acting career blossomed with Tennessee Shakespeare Company, and I've done some film and television in the Tennessee area. And now I live in Atlanta, Georgia, where I am based, still doing television and film, and I do a one-person show on Frederick Douglass around the country. I also coach presenters, speakers, salespeople, with how to be engaging with communication and how to be engaging with storytelling. And that pretty much sums up what I do. And I'm a speaker.
Sounds like you are quite a busy man.
Oh, yes. Yes, I am.
Thank you for the introduction. And there is a lot to follow up on, but the reason why I thought it would be great to speak to you is because it sounds like you do have a fascinating story. So are you happy to start with wherever you feel is relevant in terms of where your story begins?
Sure. Really, I grew up in my early years of my youth, a very timid child, almost afraid of my own shadow. And
Why is
so
that?
my father, huh?
Why is that, would you say?
Um, I don't know. I think at that time in my life, when I think back on those days, everything just seemed to be gigantic to me when I think back as a little boy. Um, and I think even in my adult life, I can be faced with things that seem so gigantic. I have to do a specific work to frame my mind in order to take on the challenge. But my father saw this movie and came back and was very excited because he was concerned that I was a timid child. So he took me to that movie, and when I came back, I was kicking, punching, and screaming. I had just seen Bruce Lee's Enter the Dragon. That was the beginning of my development of self-confidence. And when I found out that Bruce Lee was a childhood actor, well, I wanted to be an actor. And so eventually the desire to act took over my desire to be a martial artist. But because I was this size, which is 5'11", not quite 190 pounds, but definitely very big for a 13-year-old, I was a prime target for gang involvement. And so there was some young people in my hometown on a regular basis getting jumped by a variety of different gangs. And a friend of mine says, you're on the list. And I'm like, on the list? On the list to what? And he said, you're on the list of getting jumped. The only way out is to join this specific street gang called the Top Dogs. And so I wanted to do it because I certainly didn't want to get jumped because I had seen some of that happen. And so I decided to get involved. And during that period of time, it was once again, it was, a very terrifying period in my life. And there was an incident in a high school where one of the students got into it with one of the gang members, and he had a weapon, and he gave me the weapon to hide, and I did. And the vice principal found out about it and called me into the office, wondered where the weapon was. I wouldn't tell him. He said, well, you have a choice to make. You can continue going the route you're going and end up in juvenile jail, or I can tell your daddy, or you can do what I know you love to do, which is theater. And let me be clear. You can send me to juvenile home, you can send me to jail, just don't tell my daddy. If you know anything about are you familiar with the show Good Times?
I'm not, I'm sorry.
It's okay, it's okay. But I bet a lot of you out there are. My father was the real James Evans. So fortunately, I decided to step away from it, to step into what I knew was what was really in me, even though I was flunking my eighth grade acting class because every time I stood up in front of people, I would always forget my lines. And uh, my junior high school is what it was called back in those days. Teacher gave me a role in a Shakespearean play, Midsummer Night's Dream. I can't remember the role. I had one line. And she worked with me on that line and worked with me on that line. And it seemed like I just couldn't get it. And then when the show happened, I remember standing under bright lights and I was hearing all this strange sounds, Shakespeare. At that time, I didn't understand, but I knew my cue. And as soon as I heard my cue, I said my line, but my voice rang out throughout the whole theater and everybody looked. And in the audience was my what would become my high school theater teacher. And he came up to me and he says, you have a great presence on stage and a great voice. I want you to be a part of the theater program in the high school. And so I did. And he basically helped me with physicality by teaching me mime. And so I didn't have to speak, but I could move, which I was used to my body from martial art. So I was very comfortable with that. And I noticed I started getting responses from the audience. And that was the beginning of a spurt of confidence in being in front of an audience. So to make a long story short, I ended up eventually getting the lead role in the play, one of the plays there, which didn't happen. Normally that went to a senior in high school, and it went to me. And quite frankly, it was the 80s. So it certainly wasn't going to go to an African-American freshman, but it did. And I did the show, and I remember in the student matinee, which also was super terrifying, went really, really well. And walking home, a car slowly pulled up. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Boys in the Hood, but it was kind of like that. It's really slow, tinted windows. The windows rolled down, and it was the top dogs. And they said, they called me Big Phil during that time, said, get in. And so I got in the car. And as he was driving, he was looking through the rear view and he says, Big Phil, we saw you in that play and we think you're talented. We're proud of you. And we don't want you to go this route. And they opened up the door, let me out of the car. And that was my last experience with that particular gang. And from then on, my life began to move onward and upward, not without trials and tribulations, by the way. But acting became my thing at 14 years old. And I went on to a performing arts school called Interlochen Arts Academy, which is a high school of the performing arts. But you live there as a boarding school. Then I went on to college, SUNY Purchase Theater Arts School. I didn't finish. I left SUNY Purchase and eventually had my first acting job, which was playing Caliban in Shakespeare's The Tempest. and then from then on, I started becoming more entrepreneurial. I wrote my first one-person show, which was on Malcolm X, and eventually Martin Luther King, and then eventually Frederick Douglass. And that all just led to other theaters and tours and film and television. And then how I got into becoming a speaking coach was an accident. I was way back in 2000, oh my God, or so. I was sitting in a Starbucks and a guy sat down with me and started a conversation, and he found out I was an actor and wanted me to coach his brokers to help their presentations. And so I said, "Are you paying?" He said, "Yes." And I said, "I'm in," even though I didn't know what I was doing. And so I went and I basically just taught them acting stuff, which worked. And he loved it. So he began to kind of nurture me to other organizations, and I began to coach them. And eventually his son started a foundation that sponsored TEDx in Memphis, Tennessee. And so I became the TEDx Memphis coach, and I was a TEDx Memphis coach for 7 years and did a couple of TED Talks. Plus, I worked with over 100 TEDx speakers that basically snowballed into me being asked frequently to coach people that need help in their presentation, whether it's to speak on stages, they're already seasoned speakers, or they're terrified and they're in the corporate world and they've been hired where they now have to do presentations. And I help them with their self-confidence. So that, in a nutshell, is my story and what has led me to where I am today. Not without challenges.
Yeah, well, I heard some of the challenges, and I'd like to ask you about them. The first, I'm going to attempt to do it in order. I'm not sure whether I'll be successful or not. But the first one was around, you described yourself as a timid child. The first thing that occurred to me was that, do you think that for those children who perhaps are timid or have that sort of character about them, is acting, the skill of acting or presenting, would that help them in that
Oh,
context?
absolutely. Absolutely. I think two things. Um, I think we might be living in an age where acting is almost intellectual and philosophical and seems to be spinning in a world of an idea. When in fact, acting is very, very physical. Even when you're on camera, you may not be moving as much because of the camera, but your body still needs to be alive. And I say that because I also think what contributed to my confidence was being involved with something physical,
Mm.
martial art, and then eventually learning miming. And so I would say definitely acting, but also finding that those spaces and places that are interested in how you show up physically, because I think my timidity also had to do with feeling awkward in my body. And so I would say yes, acting definitely is a way to bring about confidence, but also to being involved with something physical to also assist in that, in that journey.
Yeah, I phrased it as for kids, but it almost sounds like it would even be beneficial for those who, adults who perhaps are feeling not very confident. If they take an acting class, it sounds like that might help them. But you did mention in your near your opening that there are times, even as an adult, when you feel things are big and scary, for lack of a better term, and you have to reframe that. You do an exercise. Would you mind sharing what that exercise is?
Sure. And let me just say before I answer that, when I discovered coaching, my biggest concern was how do I translate the acting world to the corporate or organizational world? And I think I've built a really good bridge for that. But it's interesting you should say that, because now what I'm coming to understand is that the things that I know as an actor, which is really the first way that I work with a organization, a business, small business, commercial real estate, that I think that I don't want to shy away from anymore, acting techniques that I really do think will get presenters and salespeople within their bodies and be able to express themselves authentically, intellectually, emotionally, and through communication to help achieve their goals and building teams and making sales and things of that nature. So I kind of wanted to throw that out there, that that's a new revelation for me. But as far as the exercise that I do, there's one technique that I mention all the time when I'm coaching people. And have you heard the term ethos before?
Yes, but I'm not sure I'd be good at defining it.
Most people are in the same situation. You've heard it, you've learned it, maybe in college, but you've forgotten it. And so that's typical. But ethos is ethics. And ethics is um, on the surface level, having experience or expertise in what you're talking about. A little deeper than that is resonating with what you're saying, not saying what you think people want to hear, and not being afraid to say what you actually believe. But on the deepest level, it's the stories that you tell yourself. It's interpersonal communication. It's your belief in yourself. And a lot of times we don't believe in ourselves because of the stories that we're constantly telling ourselves. So the exercise that I do, I realize if I see something bigger or get into that space of, a giant, my Goliath, as it were, the story that I tell myself is I'm too small. Goliath is way too big for me to take on that. Well, that's not true. Size and experience and expertise and talent is relative. So I can reverse that story that I tell myself saying that Goliath is too big, and I can retell myself the story to say, but I can outsmart Goliath with an understanding of my gifts, talents, and intelligence, with strategy. I can actually make this giant thing become extremely small. And as a matter of fact, through my imagination, I can make myself bigger than Goliath if I so choose, because that's how powerful the imagination is. And so that is one of the exercises that I do to help me face my Goliaths.
It sounds great. And yeah, I generally like the approach of there is a way. I just have to find the way. If you're trying to accomplish a big task, there is a way rather than I can't do it. So I can imagine how that exercise would be very effective. Next, in your story, you spoke about being on the list, which I'd never heard before. So maybe I've lived a sheltered life, perhaps, but I did not know that gangs would put people on a list, and you either joined or you got assaulted, essentially. Um, I want to ask, what should someone do if they're in the same position, because you've actually experienced it, and any further thoughts you have on the issue?
Well, you know, the reality is that there's some people that are living in a reality that I really didn't experience. What do I mean by that? Um, from this perspective, I would say don't do it, because you're basically you're enslaving yourself. And the people that actually make it through and come out of it, right, without any major, thing happening to them is very little. It's like going to the casino, basically. It's casino odds. But for the most part, you're enslaving yourself because your life is not your own anymore when you join a gang. Um, that's what I would say now. But here's the reality: a gang is a military. A gang is a corporation, and it's very, very, very well organized. And so when you're asking a young person that may not have order in their life, may not have parental guidance in their life, and may be faced with warfare in their community, to then ask them to say no to joining a gang, well, it's, it's easy for me to say.
Mm.
I will say that, the reality of the streets is you're faced with death and you're faced with jail, but things are not black and white. They're just not. There's a lot of gray in there. So yeah, there's camaraderie, there's order, there's a sense of self-worth. There's all these different things. But the flip side of the coin is a reality too. You're basically committing yourself to the possibility of serving time. You're basically committing yourself to the possibility of dying. And so, or dying at a violent death, as it were. But I would say that we're faced with death in jail anyway, because you never know what's going to happen to you in life. And so, how do you want to show up to life? And since you know that you could potentially face death in jail anyway, why not say no to it? And why not say yes to what's really within you? What your purpose really is. When we do wrong because we've misunderstood our ability to do what we really want to do, who we really want to be, what we really want to have. We've misunderstood. We're not living. When we misunderstand, living becomes backwards. And when you spell live backwards, it's evil.
Well,
When
just
you,
for definition of terms, sorry to interrupt your flow. The just so that people understand, because in terms of like gang, like what that actually means, like
Mhm.
I think some people might say like it might be a gang when it's like 5 young kids who aren't very organized, or it could be like thousands of organized crime with tattoos and stuff. So in your experience, what was that like for you?
Um, it's not that. If you want to understand gangs, then study militaries. If you want to understand what gangs are fighting for, then understand what militaries around the world are fighting for even right now. If you want to understand the organization of gangs, then study corporations. That's what a gang is. And as a matter of fact, it's not really a gang. It's been titled a gang in actuality. Um, they consider themselves organizations. So, branding yourself with tattoos is on your body is, you know, branding yourself with a logo. It's your brand. Your uniform may be a United States military uniform, but depending on what gang you are, your dress, the way you dress, that is literally the uniform of that particular gang. What the media covers are the street soldiers, the pawns. The media doesn't cover the knight, doesn't cover the bishop. I'm speaking of chess. Doesn't cover the rook, doesn't cover the queen, doesn't cover the king. It looks too much like the military, or it looks too much like corporations. So it focuses on the street soldiers. So when I joined, I was 13. So that's a street soldier. Why would kids join? Because at that time, they recruited children because children would just go to juvenile home and then they'd get right back out. That was my, experience with it. It the interaction between rival gangs and the interaction between gangs and civilians was a mirror image of the governments around the world.
Well, at what point do you take up martial arts?
I started taking martial arts when I was about 7 years old. I still practice martial arts. I practice Tai Chi. People think Tai Chi is just, the slow movement, which to me is the best of Tai Chi because it promotes health. But Tai Chi Chuan is the martial art, which looks more like judo, aikido, jujitsu. And
And you do
so
both?
I do, yeah, more so Tai Chi. I did kickbox at one point in my life, but I still appreciate Tai Chi Chuan, which is Tai Chi means the supreme ultimate. Tai Chi Chuan means Chuan is fist, so supreme ultimate fist. And the two best examples of what Tai Chi looks like in combat, in sports, it would look like judo, and Tai Chi in sports would look like boxing.
And
In the
any
streets,
lessons that you've taken away from being a lifelong martial artist?
life lessons.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that soft is stronger than hard. What I mean by that is a lot of times we think that extreme masculine force is where all the power is. And I've learned through martial arts it's not true. There's a place for it because you need balance, right? If you understand the yin and yang symbol, that's what that is, balance. Masculine and feminine, positive and negative, light and dark. So both are good. They're neutral, really, is what they are. But from my experience, soft is hard, and sometimes hard is soft. So extreme force is not always the best way.
Is there perhaps some fatigue references there, in the sense that certainly if you go all out, as you said, major masculine energy, and you get fatigued, then you become, basically weak. Is that some reference that you're making there?
Yeah, I mean, you really, there's really more, uh, like I said, gray area in there, more balance in there. You really need both. But it's true that if you exert your energy, too much of your energy, that can be used against you. If you exert force towards someone, whether it's through argument or through physical force, um, that can be very detrimental to you. you know, um, and I think too it applies to habits. We have goals and things we want to achieve, and because we have this big idea of it, we want to attack it with everything we possibly can, and then we burn out. But my martial arts teacher, who's a master, actually said 5 minutes a day is better than 3 hours every other day because of the law of momentum.
Okay, thank you for that. And had you considered using any martial arts in your being on the list scenario? Were you thinking that you'd have to use some of that?
Oh, and yes, yeah, I did have to use it. I did have to use it when I joined, yeah. And that's the reason why they targeted me, because I was, at 13 years old, I was kickboxing, and I was kickboxing adults because I had an adult body, so I was well known as being a fighter back in those days, and so
Any
I
stories you
did,
would like to share there?
yeah. Um, unfortunately, this martial arts studio was exploiting me. what they did was illegal. But the specific martial arts studio was sort of a descendant of Chuck Norris. And if you know Chuck Norris was a major martial artist, friends with Bruce Lee. I don't think that the studio and what they did with me had anything to do with Chuck Norris, by the way. But it attracted me to this studio that basically taught, kickboxing, not just taekwondo and Korean martial art, but also, how to fight in the ring. And at that time, everybody thought I was going to be a heavyweight, kickboxer champion. And so I was very, very excited about it. And I did some fighting. I fought, my age, I fought in tournaments. If anyone knows in Flint, the Bird, which is a professional boxing family, I think one of the sons was a heavyweight champion. I studied with them during that period of time. And if you're from Flint, Michigan, if you know the name Jackie King, sort of a legendary martial artist, I fought him. I was 13 when I fought Jackie King. And so anyway, I'm aging myself, but I'm getting over that now. Because we're doing these podcasts, people are going to know anyway. But way back a long time ago, way back in the 1900s, there was a welterweight champion whose name was Sugar Ray Leonard. And he was my idol at that time. And he had won all of his fights just dramatically and beautifully and, with grace and power and speed. But then he was coming up against a fighter whose name was Roberto Duran, the Hands of Stone. And if you know anything about the history of that first fight, it was tragic for us all who loved Sugar Ray because he did not win. And Roberto Duran he was the Mike Tyson of that day, just intimidating beyond, description. So I went on this trip to fight in Duluth, Minnesota. And we get there, and the kid I was supposed to fight, who was like 17, 18, 19 years old, got sick. So they said there's somebody that's going to come in to replace him. So I was like, okay, that's cool. So in walks this man that was 28 years old. Now you got to admit, I'm 13, who looks like Roberto Duran. I couldn't believe it. It was a nightmare. Remember, I have a man's body, but I'm 13 years old, whose idol has just been beaten by Roberto Duran. Now I have to fight Roberto Duran? So anyway, I have a little issue with my nose at my age, at this time of my life, because he broke it.
Oh dear.
Yeah, that was my first loss.
I'm sorry to hear that, but it doesn't sound like a fair fight. So,
well, let me tell you what happened. The one thing I was able to do, I was a great body puncher. And I mean, I was tearing his body up the best I could, but he knocked me out. Anyway, when he knocked me out, I'm sitting in the thing just kind of dazed. Like, I didn't know what happened. Nose is bloody, sore, And I find out that one of the ring guys runs over to the guy who beat me and says, I can't believe you did that. You don't realize that was a 13-year-old kid. So the next thing I know, this guy, this Roberto Duran guy, who I can only imagine is one of the meanest guys on the planet, because as a 13-year-old, all I'm seeing is Roberto Duran, comes over to me and he's like, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. Are you okay? Do you know that guy, that fighter, came to the house where I was staying to check on me? I was asleep. He stayed there the whole night to make sure I was okay.
Sounds like he was not as much of a victim as you were, but still a victim as well, because he didn't even know himself, right?
He didn't know. He didn't know. And I remember that as just a beautiful example of compassion, but then also, too, you can't judge a book by its cover, and that, fighting, acting, working in environments doesn't mean that you are that. He was a fighter, but that was the skill set that he had. He was also a good human being.
Mm.
So that's the story of when I, as a 13-year-old kid, fought an adult.
Well, thank you for sharing that. It's a great story. And I guess it takes a lot of courage to get in the ring regardless. But the one thing I wanted to ask you about was on your profile, it mentions the meeting with the vice principal. And my initial sort of thoughts about it were it's like this big fork in the road for you in the sense that you're choosing one of two paths, and one's sort of more positive and one is a life of perhaps ending in prison essentially. Was it like that for you, or was it kind of these incremental steps that got more positive?
I would say both, but definitely for a child, right, at 13 years old, because you're going through a massive change, you know, even biologically and mentally, but also as a Black child, African American child. At 13 years old, it was very pivotal. You don't understand. This gang was not. It was a dangerous gang. Put you that way. Very, very dangerous. Did some very, very, horrible and dangerous things. And I could have been very much involved in that. And you have to also know that this was right on the brink of the crack epidemic that spread throughout the United States. And Flint definitely was hit by it. And a lot of those gang members became drug dealers. While I was away at Interlochen Arts Academy, my city was completely transforming based on crack and the selling and using of it. So that moment was a very pivotal moment for me, because in that moment, and you, once again, you can't just make everything black and white. I could have chosen to go that moment, and still maybe came out on the other side of it and had a different destiny that ended positive. Even in the moment that I chose, it didn't mean that I wasn't going to go through some things that I actually went through that was pretty, traumatic, right? But in the bigger picture of everything, um, that that moment was a fork in the road for myself that really influenced what was going to happen in my destiny. I would say, based on who I am now, from then on out. And I had a chance to call Mr. Bronson, who was the vice principal, back in 2018, to thank him. And we had an hour-long conversation. I hadn't talked to him since that office conversation.
That's amazing. How did the conversation go?
Oh, it was beautiful. It was amazing. He was so for both of us, it was reasonably emotional. He's not the most emotional person. He was a hardcore, very hardcore vice principal. You ever see the movie Lean on Me with Morgan Freeman? It's about the principal in America that walked around with a paddle and was very
No, I don't think I
controversial.
have. I think you've got one for the list there, though. I'm going to watch that now.
Yeah, well, you should see it. That's Mr. Bronson, basically. Um, and but he was just really thankful, because you never know as a teacher or as an administrator the impact that you have on so many young people. And he wasn't liked, because he was so strict. He was not liked. I didn't like him back during that time. I didn't like Mr. Bronson. I didn't want to have nothing to do with him. But he was so thankful of that kind of influence, and that I would come to him so many years later to give him an update on how that moment transformed my whole life and
That's
got
great.
me to the place where I am right now, so.
And how does your one-man show come about?
Well,
And
well,
as a side note as well, sorry to interrupt, but what do you think of Malcolm X, the film?
okay, yeah. Well, first, as far as how my one-person show came about, it's very, very simple. Um, I left school, which was a whole other weird, situation for me. Came home. I quit acting, by the way. And I came home to Flint, Michigan, and I was sort of a wanderer. I had no direction, no idea, where I was going. And that didn't last long because it's in me, to act. And so I get cast in this play at U of M Flint. And while I'm there, um, actually backtrack a little bit. Right when I am on the journey, on the road to getting back into acting, I'm also a very young, handsome man. So I'm having all these girlfriends. I'm living at home. And one day my father sat me down. He says, "You got to go. You can't live here no more." So he kicked me out. And so I had to find a room. Well, ironically, right when I was in search for a room is when I got cast as Caliban in The Tempest, my first acting job, and my checks helped me pay for my room. So I was on cloud nine. It was the most beautiful thing. My father and I, had a good, conversation. He used to tell me as a little boy, when you turn 18, I'm going to fix you a nice breakfast. We're going to have a nice sit down, make you a little coffee, but also your bags will be packed and waiting for you at the door. Well, he pretty much fulfilled his promise.
Tough
So,
love.
yeah. And so I'm just loving this moment of being a working actor, living on my own. But of course, like most of us working actors, that contract runs out. So I'm thinking, I really want to work. So I get cast in another play, and it's Macbeth. It's a young cast of Macbeth, and I was cast as the man himself. And the director of this thing, he was like, you should think about doing a one-person show on Langston Hughes. And you don't have to wait for someone to cast you, and that you can basically be drive your own destiny as an actor. And so I was like, oh, that's not a bad idea. Well, I got hired at U of M to work as a security guard. And at that time, I had this little goatee and I had these little Malcolm X glasses. And back in the 90s, Black people, our hair was kind of cut high top fades like how Black people wore their hair in the 60s. So the head of security was Muslim. And he looked at me and he said, "I know you're an actor and you look like Malcolm X. You ever think about doing a show on Malcolm X?" Bing. And so this youth theater that I was working with a little bit, kind of teaching and what have you, I said, I really want to do a one-person show. I have a great idea about it. I just don't know whether to do Langston Hughes or Malcolm X. They said, well, we already bring in a guy doing Langston Hughes. How about we get behind you to do Malcolm X? And so that was the beginning of me doing Malcolm X, which was I just wanted to work as an actor. But in researching Malcolm X, it became much more than that for me, because researching Malcolm X opened up my young mind to this whole other world of history and culture that I had no idea about, that was also very life transformative in changing. And I think the thing that drew me to Malcolm X was that he also was a searcher And it was the power of the written and spoken word that was constantly transforming him, all the way until his untimely death. And I love performing for young people, and I wanted them to see that transformation. So, and then as far as the movie, Spike Lee's Malcolm X, I thought it was amazing. I mean, I thought it was, you know, at that time especially, it was an incredible film and an incredible feat for Spike Lee back during that time. And there have been other Malcolm X's that have been caught, you know, actors that have, you know, caught the personality of Malcolm X in a variety of different television shows. And I think what's interesting is that he was so complex that all these actors, they really only capture one element of Malcolm X. You know, Denzel caught his version, which was amazing, but it wasn't fully the full three-dimensional Malcolm X. It just wasn't. But some of these other actors will capture elements of Malcolm X that Denzel didn't capture. You know, I'm sure my version of Malcolm X is my version. You know what I mean? And so that's what's sort of amazing about Malcolm, is that he really had all these different elements to who he was and what he was all about. So it was a very fascinating character. And then that, of course, led to the other shows that I do now.
Well, thank you for that. It's impossible for me to dislike a Denzel film, which is why I asked you. But I'm sure
Yeah.
you've heard that 100 times.
Oh, Denzel is a master at what he does.
Last thing I wanted to just ask for your expertise on is the TEDx. It's become a very sought after thing, is to be a TED or a TEDx speaker. Have you
Sure.
got any thoughts for people who would like to do it, and in terms of what your best advice is as a coach?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that doing a TEDx talk, if you Google it, there's a really fantastic book on TEDx by, I think, the founder of TEDx that can give you some assistance. And he also has videos that will also give you some insight at, you know, what it's kind of dated in a sense, because back during that time, the TEDx form or TED Talk form was 19 minutes. And in this day and time, a TEDx talk could be anywhere from 7 to 12 minutes on average. But I would say the first thing you want to do is uh, think of a topic that you're really authentically connected to, something that's in you, that you've lived with, as opposed to finding something gimmicky that you really are not connected to. That's the first thing that I would say. Then the part of the TEDx formula is you're going to take something normal and then flip it on its head so that the audience, they're seeing it through a different lens. And in the end result is then something enlightening, where you never will look at that subject the same again. That's the TEDx formula. For instance, one of my titles was Storytelling as a Yoga of the Soul. So when you listen to that talk, your paradigm of storytelling changes, because in that talk, you know, we normally think of storytelling as being of benefit to someone else, but actually, when you tell a story, it has the same benefit on you mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually as yoga does. You see how that is? So you want to think about that. And then lastly, you want to think about what is the story, because if you want to get to the emotions of people and really get them to act, you must get them emotionally, and the best way to do that is through storytelling. And then what is the big idea that you want to transmit to the audience so that your idea becomes their idea in developing a tribe? And then lastly is how you build a relationship with the audience. In other words, a monologue is the death of a speaker. That there must be a sense of dialogue between you and the audience. The audience may not say anything, but it's the way that you interact with them. A lot of times through utilizing the rhetoric tool of questions, but there's many other techniques where there's a sense that it really is a discussion, a talk. And so those are the several things that I would have you think about if you wanted to develop a TED Talk.
Well, I can see why you're a coach. That's some of the best advice I've heard. And I will link your TEDx talk in the description. Is there anywhere else that people can find you or connect with you? Where do they go?
Yeah, you can go to Facebook under Phil Darius Wallace, even though my stage name is Darius Wallace. That's my full name. Or Darius Actor 357 on YouTube, or Darius Actor on Instagram. And then also my website, dariuswallace.com. These are the places where you can interact with me.
Thank you for that. I've found our conversation to be it's just been great listening to you and hearing the stories. I think they're amazing.
Thank you.
And do you have any closing thoughts for us today?
I would say that if you're struggling with anxiety and depression and low self-esteem, I want you to consider, I want to offer to you the idea that it might be, I'm no, therapist by any means, but it might be that there's something within you that doesn't believe that you can be who you want to be, do what you want to do, and have what you want to have. And I want to also suggest that you tell yourself a different story, because there's only one you, there'll never be another. And the desires in you are messages, and they're problems to be fulfilled. So if you have a desire, a strong desire, that desire is meant to be fulfilled. That's why you're here on the planet, because you're the only one that can fulfill it. And you can do it by telling yourself a different story, one that's of benefit to you and not of, self-destructive ideas about who you are.
Great message to end on. Darius, thank you for being a great guest today.
Thank you. I appreciate being here. Thank you for reaching out to me, and I'm honored, and I really am thankful to be on your show.